Hey guys, with another One Take review, and today I want to talk about Jane's Addiction's Nothing's Shocking. Nothing Shocking was just about the absolute opposite of its very own name when it was released into the world in 1988, as it kind of managed to defy a lot of what was coming out of not only rock music in general, but specifically Los Angeles when the year it was released. I mean, if you look at the state of the genre at the time, again, especially that Los Angeles scene, it was a lot of sort of over the top cartoonisms of bands like Motley Crue or Poison. And while there's nothing wrong with either of those bands or that whole style in general, or at least I don't personally think so, Jane's Addiction definitely did kick the proverbial door down for what would eventually become grunge in the coming couple of years, and also managed to fuse together a bunch of other styles of rock music as well, and very well nonetheless. The instrumentation here is excellent, and I must say that very few bands that were as young as Jane's Addiction were in 1988, again, I'd like to remind you this is their debut album, sound as well put together and as consistently well thought out as a collective as they do here. Some artists fall to the sense of a lack of cohesion as younger artists and end up with a landing on the cold hard floor that is a failure of a debut. Others embrace the independency of each individual member of the group and manage to make it work for them in their own youthful, musically ambitious way. If you look at a particularly great punk debut like the Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks, or a particularly great straight-up rock debut like Are You Experienced by the Jimi Hendrix Experience, it becomes apparent that each individual members of those bands in the youth of those collectives were sort of very individual from one another, and while that sense of individuality and independence from each other actually kind of ended up gluing them together, it's still there. It's still something that defines those records. You can listen to, say, Are You Experienced, and you can individually pick out, these are the moments where the drums are great, these are the moments where the guitar is great, this is the moment where the bass is great, the vocals are great here, etc., etc. There's not really a sense of proper cohesion in the sense of actual musicianship. Nothing Shocking kind of puts a counter reverse maneuver on this entire trope of rock and punk music by making sure that each individual member of the band, when put together, feels like one proper giant beast, even with this being their debut record. I mean, sure, Dave Navarro's guitar work is fantastic and kind of goes to show why he was such a great guitarist with the Red Hot Chili Peppers as well. Perry Farrell is a electric frontman, there's no denying that. Eric Avery's bass and Stephen Perkins' drums are even some of the best rhythmic performances that came out of the 80s LA scene. That being said, though, the thing that makes Jane's Addiction so unique and Nothing's Shocking such a great record is the fact that even with all of these individually great performers, they really come together to sound more like a complete jigsaw puzzle rather than just the pieces scattered about. I mean, sure, there's a level of rawness here that it probably would have worked if each member did feel a little more individual in their overall sound, in the overall mixing of the record, and in the overall performance of the record. But at the same time, I kind of like it this way. I kind of prefer it this way, almost. There are some bands that make individual members really having their own respective time to shine work, and there are some bands that make the entire band shining all at once for the entirety of an album work. And Jane's Addiction definitely falls in the latter category. As I hinted at before, the heaviness of Nothing Shocking definitely foreshadows grunge music in general, and its early 1988 release, I believe it was in April, I could be wrong about that, but I believe it was in April of 1988, it definitely makes it something a little bit proto-grunge, and something that would be developed alongside artists like Mudhoney, and in the following year Nirvana when they debuted with Bleach, until the genre's mainstream popularity, and well, you all know how that went. But the point still stands that Nothing Shocking, while not technically grunge, definitely embraces a sound that would go on to become extremely popular later on, and it almost makes sense in that way that grunge would become popular, considering you could argue that Jane's Addiction are one of the first proper, straight-up 100% alternative bands to actually hit the mainstream. And nonetheless, while I would associate Nothing Shocking with the grunge scene more than I would the LA strip scene, the band's presence and birth from the LA strip scene is still very prominent here. The influence from it, I should say. The fun, bouncy sound of one of pop metal's last great hurrahs of popularity is very evident here, with a lot of very funk-based songs like Idiot's Rule and Standing in the Shower Thinking being super groovy bass lines overlapped by these really funky, fun, enjoyable, energetic guitar riffs. You can kind of see how one would managed to be into bands like the aforementioned Motley Crue, Poison, Def Leppard, etc., etc., but at the same time still have an appeal to a later audience that would go on to develop grunge. There really is a sense of combining the two here, that moodiness of the early 90s and the sort of colorfulness, I guess, of the late 80s, and I think it makes, again, Jane's Addiction a very unique and interesting band within the context of rock music history. There are also a number of psychedelic flourishes found throughout Nothing Shocking that help it stand out from its other proto-grunge peers, like the aforementioned Mudhoney's Superfuzz Big Muff EP, which actually came out later in the same year in 1988. The two songs that open up both sides on Nothing Shocking are Up the Beach and Summertime Rolls, and those are the two songs that arguably wear psychedelic influence the most on their sleeves, or at least the most apparently, directly. However, there are a number of moments on the album that could arguably be traced back to the 60s psychedelic music scene, with a lot of very melodic bridges that build up to these very tripped out and very powerful choruses, as well as slightly altered or distorted guitars, as well as vocal recordings. They're all definitely references that just kind of harken back to the older days of psychedelic music, while still heavily embracing that, again, like I said before, 80s pop metal kind of sound, as well as a sort of metal hard rock kind of sound that would define the early 90s, really. With all of this positivity being put out there, I do feel the need to say that I do feel like a couple tracks here go on for just a little bit longer than is actually needed of. Oddly enough, I'm actually not referring to either of the longest songs on Nothing Shocking, Summertime Rolls and Ted Just Admit It. Rather, songs like Had a Dad or even the fan-favorite Mountain Song feel like they go on for just a bit too long, in my personal opinion, which is kind of odd considering they're really the length of your average single at the time. Perhaps a more old-school punk-like verse-chorus, end-of-song kind of format would have done the record some favors, at least on a handful of tracks. But then again, if this were the reality, we would miss out on a lot of very excellent instrumental moments, like a lot of Dave Navarro's ripping guitar solos. So really, in a way, you can't win with this. Jane's Addiction are too talented to really warrant cutting down their material, but at the same time, Nothing Shocking still feels like it deserves it. It's kind of a paradox almost, but it's one that exists nonetheless. Overall, Nothing Shocking was a major force in rock music when it came out back in 1988. Jane's Addiction refused to be directly affiliated with the corny glitz and glam of the popular music of their hometown, but at the same time, they were directly a part of it. They embraced their psychedelic and their metal and punk influences in a way that hugely defied the mainstream, but at the same time, they were one of the first alternative bands to actually dive into the mainstream. They truly are one of the most oxymoronic rock bands to ever walk the earth. That's what makes them great, however, as Jane's Addiction's work on Nothing Shocking, while it has been overshadowed by the albums that it would influence in the early through mid-90s, or at least a good handful of them, it still proves that not only was 1988 a great year for music, but Nothing Shocking made it all that much better and all that much more important, at least in terms of the genre of rock music. And it's for that reason that I am going to give Nothing Shocking 4 stars out of 5. Again, some songs here kind of go on for a little bit longer than needed, and there are a couple tracks that don't really just pique my interest too terribly much, even if I do recognize they are excellently executed. But still, nonetheless, 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this review, and I'll see you guys in the next one.